Welcome everyone to meeting number, where is it, 7? Of our course on Europe in crisis. Right now, Israeli-European relations are in crisis, so even more interesting. And this is a special meeting that we're fortunate to host Professor Dr. Heinz Gardner from University of Vienna. And thank you for coming and braving the way. This was after 2 cancellations of flights. And I also want to thank Dr. Eyal Rubinson, my old-time PhD student, who's now a lecturer at Ariel University. It is with the Ariel University Finance that we are fortunate to host Professor Gardner today. So thank you, Eyal, for making this happen, and also the Daniel Abraham Center for treating you all for a nice snack, the buffet. So thanks for them. And this is also a meeting of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, your professional association for EU studies. I urge all of you to join and take part in our events. So I remind you that this is a 90-minute seminar. We will commence with 45-minute presentation, Professor Gardner, and then we will have some intervention by Eyal and myself, and then we will open to the floor so that you can all ask questions. Following that, there'll be a 15-minute break, and we come back for the quiz at 8 p.m. And we are told we must finish all the food before we leave the premises. So nobody leaves without a sandwich, because otherwise I don't know where I'm going to take all the leftover food. Okay. So with that, I will now give the floor to Professor Gardner. We have arranged for a speaker. You want to test it now to see?
No, I test the students back in the back, because if you don't hear me, just raise your hand. Then I put this on. If it's fine to you, then I will continue without this.
So
it's up to me.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Sade. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you for you to come. Also, Dr. Rubinson, he found me actually. So he's doing neutrality studies, and he thought, how there are other guys and scholars who are working on neutrality. So he found me. That's why I'm here. So since now I'm looking at your faces, most of you are, of course, students. This reminds me of an anecdote. Just recently, I got an email of a former student of mine, and he would write me, Professor Gärtner, if I had 2 hours to live, I would attend your class. Of course I was pleased, no? Of course I was pleased. And then I scrolled down a little bit and was looking for the reason. And I could read, yeah, because your lectures feel like eternity. So I speak for 45 minutes, I have a limit. No eternity now. Yeah, I will speak about neutrality, a little bit about concepts. We are all students, academics here, so concepts are important. Then a little bit about history. It's a little bit revisionist Austrian history, because I'm not in the mainstream of the Austrian historians. So I'm focusing on things which usually in Austria not so much discussed, but I'll let you know what the difference is. Then I will talk a little bit also about European Union and neutrality and the future of neutrality as well. With my students, we worked out about 21 definitions of neutrality. They're all in the book I gave you. Maybe you can make it available to the students. 21 definitions. That's already tells you that neutrality is a very flexible concept. So neutrality changed over time. So some neutral states disappeared, others emerged in a different type. So I will not present you all the 21, but the most important one, which are discussed in the neutrality studies. Can you hear me? Good. So a very traditional distinction is between integral neutrality and differential neutrality. So integral, it's a Swiss debate, mainly because Switzerland is, of course, a very traditional neutrality and a very sophisticated discussion about neutrality already. But integral neutrality means an comprehensive neutrality. So being neutral in all kinds of areas, not only military, but also economic, not so much values, but when it comes to sanctions, for example, also to some extent cultural, so very, very comprehensive. It's a sort of isolationist neutrality, stay out of everything. But then over time, of course, neutrality had to adapt, and then we had the League of Nations after 1918, and they imposed sanctions on several countries. Switzerland would participate, and they said, okay, not integral, we call it differential. It's mainly military, not so much economic, because we want to participate. So Switzerland is moving forth and back. So it's oscillating between those two. Next year, there will be a referendum in Switzerland. And again, one major party wants a referendum to include the term integral neutrality in the constitution, because the Swiss constitution mentions neutrality, but doesn't explain what it is. So in contrast to the Austrian neutrality. So this is one main distinction. Of course, the neutrality of the 19th century, what I call occasional neutrality. That means being neutral during the time of war. So if there's a war, I want to stay out. So if not, so maybe I'm not so much neutral. In contrast, and that's what Austrian neutrality is about, and also the Swiss neutrality is about, what we call permanent neutrality. It's very much confused. Permanent does not mean eternal, so some confuse it. Permanent means neutrality not only in times of war, but also in times of peace. I come back to this. So you have to demonstrate that you are neutral. You're going to be neutral also in the next war if we don't know, even if you don't know what kind of war that will be. So permanent neutrality is a very important expression. It means neutrality between in both peace and war. Then there is this strong type of neutrality which is based on international law. So very few countries' neutrality is based on international law. This includes Austria, Switzerland, and Turkmenistan. So they have, but the recognition as a neutral state by international law has very different rules. So I don't want to go to much detail. Switzerland goes back to the 1815 after the Napoleonic War, Vienna Congress. Of course, Austria in 1955 provided information to the United Nations, notified all the states which have diplomatic relations with Austria, whether I oppose it or not. And Turkmenistan, there was a decision by a UN General Assembly that Turkmenistan will be neutral. But anyway, based on international law, very strong. And on top of this, even stronger is if neutrality is also enshrined in constitutions. So that's domestically very strong. It's not international law necessarily, but international law and constitution are very strong neutrality. So more or less we could say Austria, Switzerland also took Turkmenistan everything there in their constitution being neutral. But there, in contrast, there are those neutral states, neutrality which is self-declared. So it's a domestic decision of the parliament, of the government, or there might be a referendum as well. It's a type of neutrality, but it's pretty weak, because you can change it more easily. And even if it's based on strong historical roots, like Finland and Sweden, but it was not based on international law, at some point it said, no, not neutrality, but rather non-alignment, and then they joined NATO. So there was no, they didn't have to ask anybody. There was it was a domestic decision. In Austria developed, and under this legendary Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, they developed this active neutrality. That means not only neutrality on legal terms, but political terms. So a neutral states have to seize the opportunity not only for mediation, but to host international organizations, to provide suggestions, what Kreisky did for the Middle East, and also the Marshall Plan in the Third World. So it goes beyond. So already the traditional type of neutrality based on international law. Since we are not in the 70s anymore, and Austria is a member of the Partnership for Peace of NATO, member of the European Union, provides peacekeeping troops all over, Austrian neutrality is value-based. There's neutrality, no neutrality between values. You have to have some values when it comes to massive human rights violations, or war, or genocide. Neutral states should raise their voice, so without derogating neutrality. So I call this type of neutrality engaged neutrality. So engagement as much as possible and staying out as much as necessary. So that's pretty much the contrast to integral neutrality, to this isolationist neutrality. So when it comes to the right-wing parties, they once in a while also mention and have in their program neutrality. Right-wing parties are changing it all the time because they're populist. But once in a while, they have this neutrality in their program, like the right-wing party in Austria as well. But I'm not speaking for the entire party, but for the leadership of the party. So they are more on the side of this isolationist neutrality. So, and it's different to the neutrality I was mapping out here. But I'm not going to, we have non-alignment, and we have all kinds of other types of hiding and neutrality, which I'm not going to mention here. The Austrian neutrality law is a pretty succinct definition of neutrality. It's mainly on the military side. So, because it's very limited. So Austria should not, and that's the major thing about neutrality. That's the basic red line, not join a military alliance. Because with security commitments, because if you give security commitments to somebody else, you promise to go to war for somebody else. That's what a neutral state cannot. So alliances and neutrality are not compatible. The second feature is no permanent deployment of foreign troops on Austrian soil. And the third is a little bit more complicated, because I was talking about permanent neutrality. That implies that Austria is prohibited to participate in foreign wars. Concerning international law, it's even more complicated, but it refers to the Hague Conventions of 1907, where military neutrality is pretty neatly defined. I'm not going that far now. So this is the third feature. And now this is a exam question for international lawyers. So you shouldn't make this mistake, because if you make this mistake, you get a negative grade from international law professors in Austria. Austria has a state treaty, which has been signed in May 1555, and Austria has a neutrality law, which was adopted by the parliament in October 26, 55. So legally, different types of institutions. Politically, there is a link, because Austria politically had to promise the signing partners of the state treaty that it will adopt neutrality. Otherwise, they would not have accepted the state treaty. So that's one reason, especially now talking about this, and you asked this question, I guess, yesterday. Yes. over dinner. Of course, Austria wanted to adopt neutrality themselves by the parliament, and doesn't want to have it imposed. And but it was also President Eisenhower who insisted that the Austrians adopt neutrality themselves, because he feared that the Soviets would start to interpret neutrality later on. So, having said this, President Eisenhower was the staunchest defender of Austrian neutrality. So without President Eisenhower, there would be no Austrian neutrality. So that goes against the mainstream historical narrative in Austria, because the mainstream narrative is Americans were against neutrality and the Soviets imposed neutrality on Austria. I studied all the documents. It's still there, the main narrative, but it's wrong. It's wrong. Eisenhower had a condition, which is also enshrined in the state treaty, not in the neutrality law. No, sorry, I'm confusing. No, that's enshrined in the neutrality law, that Austria has to defend its sovereignty and neutrality by all available means. That means Austrian neutrality is armed, because you can interpret this by all available means. Of course, you have to also defend yourself with arms. So armed neutrality. Of course, you can interpret it a little broader and say, okay, that's also all available means are political. Why not? Why only arms? So there is this different debate in Austria, more political, more military. So that's, but anyway, so that was a condition by President Eisenhower. In contrast, in the Soviet Union was, first of all, beginning of the 50s, they were speaking about neutrality, but they gave it up at around end of 53, beginning of 54. No, neutrality is not sufficient anymore. Neutrality is not sufficient anymore. So we have, especially the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who was very much against, at that time, against Austrian neutrality. So he linked it to Germany. He wanted to have a peace treaty first with Germany. So that was, then there were other reasons. So he said the question of Trieste was not solved, which is it's another important question, which I will not go into, but it's interesting why the Soviets accepted that Trieste becomes part of Italy then later on. That's a different story. So Molotov procrastinated the decision about neutrality until when? It was late 54, until Germany became member it was clear that Germany became member of NATO. Then it was clear that Austria will not join Germany to become NATO members. So the argument, the ideological argument by Molotov always, there is this German militarism. So that's why we cannot support Austrian neutrality. But at that point, there was no German peace treaty. But when Germany became NATO member, then Austrian neutrality was accepted. I have just to remind you, Austria was occupied by four powers, four victory powers. Vienna was occupied, like Berlin, also by with four powers. Of course, in the Soviet zone was some separate. And there was the real danger if there would be no neutrality, that the Soviets would stay, like in Germany. So, and if Austria decided at some point, oh, we want to become a member of NATO as well, Austria would be divided like Germany. So that's, some historians deny this, but I've proved that it would have happened. There were all this Soviet industries also in eastern part of Austria. And that's what after the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, then after neutrality, the Soviets wanted to get all this German property also back and get it back to the Soviet Union. So that's a very important point. And Eisenhower was even in favor of more neutral states, especially supported Finnish neutrality. West German Chancellor Adenauer was furious. So he said, neutrality is a Soviet poison. So he would even send his ambassador in Washington to Eisenhower and say, stop talking about this neutrality. He was afraid that it would spill over to Germany. And of course, there was in 1952, Soviet leader Stalin had a note where he said, okay, let's have a neutral Germany. So there's a debate among historians whether it was taken seriously or not, so a unified neutral Germany. However, then John Foster Dulles, the foreign minister of the US, he then calmed down and said, okay, let's talk only about Austria, not about Germany. But the debate comes back. So the debate comes back. So that's Austria's now as neutrality, and the Americans supported it, and the Soviets accepted. Another point, another anecdote. There was a split in the Soviet leadership. Molotov was this Stalin faction. So he even suggested, okay, Austrian neutrality has to be linked only to German neutrality. So that's the old German Stalin proposal. But he had to tell the Austrians that they can become neutral. Why? The Khrushchev faction, they were more open because after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev, and the Austrian Chancellor Raab was smart enough to talk to Khrushchev faction most of the time and not to the Molotov faction, whilst the Austrian Communist Party supported for a while Austrian neutrality, but when the Soviet Union gave up, the Austrian Communist Party gave it up, but continued to talk to Molotov. So the decision that Austria becomes neutral took the Communist Party by surprise, because why this change in the Soviet Union? So that's, yeah, anyway, Austria became neutral. So we're still in history. That's very, very little discussed, I guess. That's very little discussed, because Austria's neutrality became an export model. Soon after 1955, Western pundits, diplomats, politicians, they would think, hey, Austria is neutral and unified, and Germany is still divided after 10 years of the end of the war. What do we do about it? So the first one was the former American ambassador to Moscow, George Kennan. So he came out with the proposal, let's have a neutral Central Europe, like Austria, and Germany, but also Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary. So unified Central Europe. Then there was a bipartisan initiative in the American Senate by the Senators Humphrey and Nolan. A similar proposal. I don't want to discuss the distinctions now. And also the leader of the British Labour Party, they came out with the same thing. So a unified, a neutral Central Europe, and with a unified Germany according to the model of Austria. We know it didn't work out. Adenauer was against it, and I guess the Soviets were against it as well, because there was already the Warsaw Pact in place in June 1955. So they wouldn't give up there. So that's, but anyway, it was an interesting model. On top of that, 57, the Polish Foreign Minister Rapatsky came and said, hey, in the Austrian State Treaty, Austria is not only neutral, but Austria is also prohibited to have nuclear weapons. So Austria is one of the first, probably the first nuclear weapon-free state, which is basically enshrined in a treaty in Europe. And he said, no, we have this neutral Central Europe with what he called disengagement, but let's make it nuclear weapon-free. So his plan was a nuclear weapon-free zone Central Europe. And all the debates, even the debate what we have here in the Middle East about the nuclear weapon-free zone, the concept goes back to the Karpatsky plan. So the concept goes back, so it's our variations. So Austria became a model for this. And another not that much known historical event comes from Johanna Nieni, a book which I edited, and we want to invite her to a conference. So she found out that Finland had, with the Soviet Union, 1948 a friendship treaty, which some say is about neutrality. It was not about neutrality, but they were committed that no one there was a bilateral treaty. No one should accept an attack from one territory to the other territory. The Finns would not have to let some NATO state attack the Soviet Union, for example, so vice versa. But there were some provisions where the Soviets can have influence on the Finns. And the Finns didn't talk about neutrality. They didn't dare. They said, we want to stay out of big power competition. And once Austria became neutral, the Finns dared to start to talk about neutrality. So there was a constant debate between Finland and the Soviet Union. They said, Finland said neutrality, the Soviets said friendship treaty. And after the invasion of the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviets would delete the word neutrality of all the bilateral treaties between Finland and the Soviet Union. What was changed under Gorbachev again. So that was much history. So I've spoke too long already. So more a little bit back to the concepts. Of course, we had in the Cold War, we know this, all of us, the bipolarity, two poles, two alliances, NATO, Warsaw Pact. Austria was not part of it. And then basically, Austria is not a child of the Cold War. Austria is an anomaly, the exception of the Cold War, because the Cold War was about blocks, about alliances. Neutrality was the attempt to stay out of blocks. So some would say, oh, Austria is neutrality is child of the Cold War, which wasn't. Basically, it was the attempt to avoid this great power conflict. After the end of the Cold War, we had this unipolarity, which was a difficult time for neutral states, because if you have a hegemon, there's not much room for neutrality, but still Austria kept the neutrality. I'm always telling anecdotes. There's another anecdote. During the unipolarity, we had all these American wars and Afghanistan and Iraq, and at a certain point, of course, there was a UN resolution to send troops to Afghanistan as well, and Austria hesitated to send many troops. Germany, nation building we do mention. Austrians would send 12 liaison officers, some point 70 in a bag. The American ambassadors all came to the Austrian defense ministry and said, why don't you send more troops to Afghanistan? There was a huge pressure. And the Austrians would say, oh, we have our troops in the Balkans, peacekeeping, we don't have resources. And behind the doors, you could hear the Austrians say, this war would not lead anywhere. We don't want to participate. So what I'm arguing, maybe it's wrong, that the Austrian intelligence was much better than the intelligence of NATO, which stayed for 20 years. The Austrian had to stay out of this conflict. So it was possible because of neutrality. So that was one. Of course, we have polarization. So, and we have now world powers. We can discuss it in different session. Maybe we have a new polarization. I just maintained it now. Polarization globally between the US and China, and in Europe between the West and Russia. So if you have a polarization in world politics, small states have two options only. One is to join an alliance or so I'm talking about Europe now. So it's mainly true for most of the states, but there are exceptions, I admit. But two options. One is joining an alliance or joining bandwagoning with a big power to get protection promises. That's the choice Finland and Sweden made. So get protection promises. Of course, then you have the danger of entanglement, because if you are a member of alliance, you get protection promises, but you also have commitments. You have commitments. If big power goes to war, of course, the Article 5 of NATO would say you have to join us. So you're entangled. You're entangled in the Americans were always very, very, very worried about entangling alliances. They're not neutral, but they always had some hesitations about too much commitment. But of course, neutral states are saying the same thing. The other option is neutrality. Neutrality means to avoid entanglement. To avoid entanglement in foreign wars. That's, of course, then you have the danger, what some would argue, of abandonment, that you're just left alone. I come back to this point a little later. So in the more policy debate, we have this in Austria now. My argument is, others would say it's more complicated. I'm not thinking that sophisticated. Maybe we have also only two options: becoming member of NATO, like Finland and Sweden, or stay neutral. There is no third option. I come back to the European Union in a few minutes. All neutral states have these two options. But in order to be neutral, you have to meet two conditions. You have to meet two conditions. You have to be credible as neutral state, and you have to be useful. What does credibility mean? So I come back to my permanent neutrality concept. Credible is that the neutral states always have to demonstrate, to raise their voice and say, we are neutral, we remain neutral, we will stay neutral, we will not participate in foreign wars, we are not going to join a military alliance, we are not deploying foreign troops. Otherwise, big powers would not listen if you don't. Armed neutrality is part of it, because for Austria, armament and neutrality are twins. So for other countries, it might be possible to separate them. For Austria, so to show that you're willing to defend your neutrality is part of the credibility. So that was a little bit a problem of Ukraine, because they would say Ukraine was not part of a military alliance. It was neutral anyway, and the Soviets invaded Ukraine, a neutral country. It was not neutral, because we can discuss the history of Ukraine, but Ukraine had NATO membership in the constitution twice. 2014, and they deleted it, and then 2021, NATO membership in the constitution as well. So you cannot be both. You cannot be credible neutral and saying I want to become a member of an alliance. That's not possible. So either you're neutral or you're a member of an alliance or want to become a member of the alliance. That was Putin, of course, using as an argument as well. So that's the Ukraine part is much more complicated, but nevertheless. So the second condition is being useful. Of course, the neutral states have to offer something. To my mind, they do not enough. So the Swiss concept is providing good offices, for example, mediation, hosting international institutions, hosting summit meetings. Austria in 1961 already hosted a meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Salt Treaty was signed at that time. So we have to offer something, and that's why Vienna has all these international organizations there, and also Geneva. So from the IEA and the UNESCO, and so that's because of neutrality. And the engaged neutrality is part of it. You have to even be more, offer more than just being host and a mediator. You have to suggest things for conflict resolution. So we can go through different possibilities. So credible and useful. So, and now, to cut a little bit shorter, I come back to this abandonment, because people would say, oh, neutral states are not protected, so nobody comes to the aid to a neutral state. So I did a study with my student as well. So, of course, I'm very much challenged in this argument, but you like it as well if you we found out with our students that a neutrality rarely in history has been violated if it was credible, except during major wars. Except during major wars. Of course, we have all these examples you mentioned that I guess yesterday is Belgium, Netherlands, and yes, there was major war, but the target countries were not the neutral states. The target countries were the hostile big powers, considered to be hostile, and the hostile alliances. Once in a while, neutral states would stand in the way of this major military operation. So that's, but taking the example of Belgium, which was, of course, invaded twice by Germany, it was 70 years, very successful neutrality after 1815. And the reason why Great Britain entered the First World War was because Belgian neutrality was violated, because Great Britain considered Belgian neutrality as credible and defendable. There's another anecdote, which is historically at a different time, but tells you that you have big powers respect your neutrality if you're credible. In 1956, there was the uprising in Hungary. And the Soviets were concerned that Hungary would leave Warsaw Pact. And they suspected the Austrians to host insurgents in their territory because there were lots of refugees. And they would threaten Austria. And then Eisenhower, Prime Minister Eisenhower, they would issue a statement: if Austrian neutrality is violated, it would be a case for a Third World War. Maybe it wouldn't have happened, but very, very strong words, because I told you, Eisenhower was behind neutrality, behind Austrian neutrality. So neutrality is a pretty good security guarantee. So the exceptions we found is, for example, Hawaii, which was neutral, and the Americans swallowed it in 1895. Or it was Mexico, which followed the neutral policy without calling it explicitly neutral in 1855, 45, 48. And America invaded it together with Texas. But we also have the case of Cambodia, which was neutral. But then there was the Vietnam War, and of course, neither the Viet Cong nor the Americans cared about the neutrality because they had overarching war goals. So neutrality is a pretty good security guarantee, except in major wars. So last point, almost the last point. I'm within my 45 minutes.
Yeah, you're good.
I told you I will speak a little bit about the European Union because there is this argument, because I told you there is only two options, alliance or neutrality. And there is the argument, yeah, Austria is member of the European Union, it's not compatible with neutrality. Austria is neutral and Austria is member of the European Union, so it is compatible. It is compatible. There is a legal debate. First of all, I don't go back in history to the Maastricht Treaty and so on. That's too far. Just the treaty which is in place is the Lisbon Treaty. It says the common defense policy of the European Union will lead in time to a common defense, so the Council decides. So there must be a political decision before it comes to a common defense. Common defense implies that there is a security commitment, which is not there yet. Well, not at all. Defense policy basically means you coordinate for peacekeeping operation, peace missions, peace enforcement, peacemaking, disarmament, whatever. What the European Union called it in the past, Petersberg does. This is enshrined. This is Article 43 and 42.1, and there is an article which has security commitments in it, Article 42.7. So very similar to the Article 5, the security commitments of NATO, which is very much now discussed because of Trump, and so Trump will abide by it. But, and if this would be enforced fully, of course, the European Union would not be compatible with neutrality anymore. Because I said alliance, that would be an alliance. Security commitments would is characterized as an alliance. But for this article, neutral states have an exemption. So the article says all states can decide whether to participate in the in this article. If the article is called upon, they can decide upon according to the constitutional requirements. So if Austria says it's not compatible with neutrality, Austria doesn't participate, right? But it's not only Austria, but it's it's not only the neutral states, but it's also all the NATO states. They say, nah, our priority is NATO. if there's a security commitment, we go for the Article 5 and not for the Article 42.7 of the European Union. So more or less, this article is not really implemented. Of course, you can. There was this example by President Hollande of France in 2015, when there was terrorist attack in Paris. He called upon this article, which in my mind was wrong, because there's a more appropriate article in the Lisbon Treaty that is 222. But anyway, he did. But also said, okay, let's participate. Let's send more peacekeeping troops to Mali to free off resources for France to fight terrorism. So it's a can article. So European Union is compatible with neutrality. That's what I'm saying. So finally, that's my final thought to end on an optimistic note, which similar what I said yesterday already, when I talked about engaged neutrality. 1975, it was the height of the Cold War. And there was a process which led up to this Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. At that time, it was Helsinki 1975. It's a very good document. It's a very good document because it doesn't identify threats. It foes enemies, rivals, or whatever. Even so, we had the height of the Cold War. It identifies only cooperative security, common security. Security is indivisible. Very, very good document. But what I'm saying, what I didn't say yesterday, is this process, it's a process, it's not a treaty, it's an agreement, it's a process for follow-up conference, would not come into existence without the neutral and non-aligned states. They were those who set up basically organizatorical, they would set up this conference and mediate between the conflicting parties of the Cold War. Non-aligned, because at that time, Yugoslavia was part of it, and Yugoslavia was not called neutral, it was non-aligned. So what I'm thinking is, what's not happening, I'm always talking about things that are not happening, but what should happen after the Ukraine war, and we should think already about this. We have to have a similar process of conference like the CAC conference. You have to have some cooperative security in Europe, or the other option is you have a permanent division, again, what we had during the Cold War, for example, with the Iron Curtain in Europe. Okay, now 45 minutes, 46 minutes.
Thank you very much. Professor Wagner? Yeah.
Great, Professor Gardner, thank you so much. It was super interesting, fascinating. I have many thoughts, but I will limit myself to three. Two substantive, Europe-related, and one provocative, perhaps, since we're in the Middle East. Although sometimes we want to forget, but nevertheless, here we are. So you briefly mentioned Finland and Sweden, which by domestic decision gave neutrality up to seek NATO membership as a result of the external shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In your view, what makes Austria's neutrality so resilient in terms of public opinion to resist this transition? That's number one. And you draw an axis for small states that is divided between alliances and neutrality. But what about middle powers, some of which are even nuclear powers? Like, for example, France or the UK, it seems they have only one option, which is alliances with superpowers, which reflects their sets of values. And I wonder what you think about that. And finally, I cannot help but to ask you to share with the students your thoughts, maybe preliminary thoughts, maybe ideal thoughts about how a future Palestinian state could adopt neutrality alongside demilitarization. Especially since you say that neutrality is a good security guarantee, will it suffice for such a future scenario?
Thank you, Yael. So I have a number of thoughts. I'm really intrigued by your original thesis about how Austrian neutrality, if any, is an American construct rather than a Soviet one. Because the mainstream interpretation, the one I've been educated on, is that this was Khrushchev's condition for taking the tanks out of Austria and allowing Austria to be an undivided country. And that line of thought seems to be justified would seem to me to be justified by Austria's joining of the European Union precisely when the Cold War was over. The story I was told that from a Soviet perspective, the efforts at European integration were, the economic aspect of the Western alliance against the Soviet Union. It was certainly a competing economic system. And so while Austria, I think, had a lot of trade and business with Germany and other countries even before, it didn't formalize it into full membership. It waited until the Cold War was over. So that kind of story would support the mainstream interpretation. But if I go along with your thought, then the next thought I have is the more disengaged the United States is from Europe, how likely it is, if you are correct, that Austrian neutrality will continue, if it is actually more a construct of American involvement and engagement in Europe. So that's one comment I would appreciate that you could make on this. I guess, cynically, I love cynicism, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
I'm fascinated by cynicism. So cynically, you would say, okay, the closer you are physically to Russia, the less neutral you become. The Finns gave it up because they are concerned. They have a very long, more than 1,000 kilometers territorial border with Russia. They always have it. It's interesting you said they were never neutral, they were friends. There was a friendship with Russia or Soviet Union. From military Western perspective, it was like they were more neutral. They too didn't join, and Sweden, 3 countries, only joined in 1995, the European Union, after the Cold War was over, and pretty much as soon as it was over. So Finland now is concerned, and it doesn't believe in friendship nowadays, so it's not neutral. Sweden has a submarine issue. When I was in Sweden for the first time, I was amazed to find out that country is an archipelago. It looks on a map like a solid mass of land, but it isn't. It's actually full of islands, and they're worried about Russian submarines. Same with Norway. So these countries feel directly threatened, at least potentially by Russia. With Austria, there's some distance to cover. And so, it makes strategically, seems to be more of an option. So I would like your comment about whether this might be another explanation for whether, how countries choose to be neutral, how viable. And the third point, which I also made yesterday when we met, is my capitalist interpretation of neutrality. Neutrality is the formalization of treasure islands where elites keep their assets from the different fighting sides. They keep a neutral country so that they can all have their arts or assets or deposits there, and it becomes a convenient agreement that this is how the elites on both sides protect their assets. We know Austria is involved in Russia. Raiffeisen is a major bank. It's not really disengaging from Russia at all. They have very good excuses why not. But from this perspective that I'm suggesting, it fits a pattern whereby the Russian elite now, under sanctions from various financial centers, can still see Austria as a place where they can keep treasures if they want them out of Russia, but out of the West too. And so maybe that is also something that supports the idea of an Austrian neutrality. I think at this point, we'll also open the floor to some questions
But then I have to memorize.
Okay.
Let's take one or two or three questions and then
You have to remind me.
the diplomatic way of it is that you can conveniently forget some of the questions if you don't want to answer them. And a lot of people get to
I really
participate.
forget them, maybe.
Lila, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I was gonna ask about active neutrality. Because it also involves international organizations, as I understood. And then you asked about Palestine, but I take it to Israel. I mean, what would be your take upon Israel being or having the ability to be actively neutral? It sounds kind of contradicting to me, actually, the idea of being actively neutral. Like it's mandatory in Austria to serve in the military. So this is kind of like us being neutral, but we send our troops to be like ready for worst case scenario wherever in all the other places. But we're neutral. So I was gonna ask you to explain further and kind of like relate to his question. But there was another question.
Jonathan?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about the question about the guarantee
Thank you.
guarantee of neutrality. When you said it's working unless it's a great war coming, and I think that Europe are now in the beginning of a great war. So does Austria make any plans for this, or they are hoping that the neutrality will keep them safe also in this conflict, if it will come?
All right.
Question more?
Yeah, with the mandatory military service, how do you make people like excited to serve in an army that's not going to fight actively? And also, where is the line between intelligence sharing and neutrality?
You remind me if you forget one. Yeah, one answer Real was given, he asked about his resilience of neutrality. So Austrian neutrality he wrote an excellent article in Cooperation and Conflict.
Yeah, we've
Yeah.
circulated that paper.
Yeah. So his expression is resilient neutrality. This encaptures many of these things. So international law, history, public opinion, because the Austrians are stubborn or persistent, 75, 80%, they're still sticking to neutrality in spite of all these attacks on neutrality, domestically. So one reason, one historical argument I could make is maybe the two questions. Austrians have a collective memory. They don't want to be part of a foreign wars, part of alliances, because Austria lost the last 100 years all the wars. So there is a high percentage of Austrians which wants to Austrian peacekeeping troops to do peacekeeping. When it comes to more to peace enforcement, which involves violence, of course, the public opinion declines a little bit. So, and I saw, of course, your question, which confirms what I'm saying, which I'm not supporting it. So that's I'm not. That has not so much to do with neutrality. That's because you asked a couple of years ago. I saw a Gallup, international Gallup poll. Would you be prepared to die and fight for your country? So, and Israel was on the very top. So, and on the bottom, there were those countries who lost the war. So they have no good experience. So that was Italy, Germany, Austria, and it was Belgium actually, because there was nothing really. They wanted to defend. So that's Yeah, because of this Finnish border question, so I don't go along with you because Austria had a long border with the Warsaw Pact as well. So that was did do very well with Austrian neutrality, was respected, did do very well, even so there was a direct threat along the Iron Curtain. So there's not that much difference to Finland. And I don't think that Finland joined NATO and Sweden because of Ukraine. It was just the reason given, and they seized the opportunity. As you correctly observed, Sweden, especially Sweden, there was long preparation already for joining NATO to make all the forces interoperable. So already before joining NATO, Sweden participate easily in NATO operations. What they did, they called it Partnership for Peace Operations, not collective defense, which is alliance operations. So it was just a little switch that they joined. The Finnish foreign minister was in Vienna, and I asked her from the audience whether there was a direct Russian threat to Finland before they took the decision to join NATO. Actually, she was honest, and she said no, there was no direct Russian threat. So, and asked her, why would you then join NATO? She gave two reasons. One is we want to be part of the NATO family. We want to be part of the NATO family, so independently of the Ukraine. And the second is, which I think is a weak argument, she said there's a cyber war, hybrid war going on globally, but that's happening everywhere. So whether you're neutral member of an alliance, even they might be now more affected by hybrid war by the Russians than they were before, because now they are hostile, part of the hostile alliance. So, and they're building up a smart fence already also, like the Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain. Your question is because of Finland. I know there is this argument, big and small. You mentioned it as well, I guess. So big,
Middle powers.
yeah, middle powers. Of course, I agree that it's easier to become neutral if you're a small power, but I don't think it's a necessary condition, because in many ways the United States behaved as a neutral state. They call it isolationism today, but after 87, in many ways, up to the First World War, with the exception of the Spanish-American War, America was neutral until Pearl Harbor again. So you can behave as a neutral state if you're a big power, but not in terms of maybe in policy terms. So that's
The ghost of Eisenhower.
yeah, I'll come back to the ghost file, but first is a capitalism. The capitalist argument, yeah, that's once in a while a price neutral states have to pay. So there's no clear-cut neutrality, no waterproof neutrality. You make all kinds of compromises. So economically, policy-wise, so dirty, the states do dirty politics in order to keep foreign. It's just during the Second World War. There was had all this German finance transactions, and so I agree. Sometimes it's a dirty business, but it's not limited to neutral states. So the dirty business too. So you might agree to that. So the ghost of Eisenhower. So it goes back to the origins, and that's well documented that the Americans supported neutrality and even threatened the Soviets with the Third World War. But then, of course, it changed over time, and I mentioned this example of unipolarity. The Americans didn't like neutrality during that time, so and then when we had this war on terror, there was this question, with us or against us. There is no space for neutrality. So the Americans under George Bush, they didn't like it either. So polarization, I say that to these two options, but neutrality is once in a while very, very difficult. You know about this Milanese dialogue during the Peloponnese War, when the Melos wanted to stay neutral and stay off. They would say, we are not enemy of anybody. That's what but we are not joining anybody of you. So in the coming war between Sparta and Athens, they were just destroyed because the Peloponnese War was looming. So the bigger war was looming. So there was no space. So, and I do think nowadays the ghost, if Eisenhower once in a while is still a ghost. So that's it's not consistent policy of the US. It depends really on the Austrians to take the Americans at their word, but what they don't, because the mainstream history argues, oh, the Americans were always against neutrality, which is definitely not true. There was this
About that. Is it a great conflict that will put your neutrality into?
Major,
thought- yeah,
major
yeah,
war
major
is coming your way.
Would it still be
you know,
neutral?
I tell you what, that I think that at least the idea of neutrality is rational or perceived rationally by the most Europeans when it comes to probably to a major war. There's this council, European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very transatlantic oriented think tank in Prague. They do a survey every 2 years. And one of the questions is, which basically is downplayed because you have to look very carefully to find it in the survey. One of the questions is, if there is a conflict, they didn't even ask military conflict, the conflict between the US and China. Which side would you take? European Union citizens. Not so many with China, but still about 10%, but not so many with the US either, less than 30%. So most of the Europeans would say we rather stay neutral if it comes to a big power conflict. So whether you really can stay out of the conflict, it can be unfortunate, and neutrality can be, there will be pressure on all parts of the conflict. But whether you can be successful, if there is a real major war, during the war, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, they could keep the neutrality. Netherlands in the First World War, you cannot ask from the neutrals what big states cannot do either. So neutrality can be destroyed if there's a big war. So that's a possibility if there's a major war. So it doesn't really protect you, as I said, during major wars, but it protects you if there is polarization, but no war. So what? Yeah, I fear this question. You know, I'm hesitant to respond.
If-
Also, the Palestinians.
Yeah, but if I may,
Yeah, please, you answer the question.
two conditions. You said a country, it's not here. A country could be neutral because if it's credible,
Yeah.
A, if it's credible, B, if it's useful. So I mean, okay, I am pro-Palestinian, I am, but Israel is rather more credible to some extent. and rather more useful. Like you said, some other states are using the same kind of defense mechanism or so I mean, I was wondering if it's possible, in your opinion, for a country like Israel to be actively neutral.
So, two questions, one Palestine, one Israel, right?
Yeah.
So that's, I know there are scholars in Israel who would defend this idea. So I would say if a Palestinian state is credible, independent from foreign influence like Iran, and even if those states like Iran would recognize Israel as a state, not only Palestine, but Israel, maybe in the borders of 67, you cannot ask more, but
Yeah.
then I could imagine neutrality if it is very credible neutrality. Neutral, I could imagine. Yeah, that's of course there's domestic issues are involved as well. Israel is part of CENTCOM, so it's not necessary. That's an excuse, I know. But it's a sort of military alliance. So it's like if you're very, very closely aligned with a big power, so that's not necessarily only an alliance. I said joining an alliance and
Yeah.
or a big power. But that's not a good answer. I agree. I would say 70% I'm with you. So
Okay.
theoretical explanation.
Yeah,
Not practically. I don't know enough about practical. But if you have to be able to defend yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Armed neutrality. No foreign troops should be deployed. And no military alliance. So politically, you could create something, but and also, of course, if you go back to the Hague Convention, you're not allowed to send weapons to conflicting parties,
That would make it.
or you have to send them to both of them equally. So it's very sophisticated international law. So and I'm not an international lawyer. But I understand your thought, I have to say. So I like thought experiments which are not realistic. So, yeah. What did I forget? Did I forget something?
Let's have another round of questions if the audience is interested. Ian? Oh, yeah, one discussion, that's right.
Or whether it's during.
Yeah. No. Yeah, it's a very good question. But it does not, it's a very good question, but it does not include, the intelligence sharing is not included in direct military aid. So that's, I would say, Austria does intelligence sharing with all kinds of especially with the US. It does not really, it's one of the small dirty things that all neutral states have to do.
After Stracher was actually ring-fenced from Western intelligence agencies. The Stracher gave it a very bad name.
Yeah. Foreign agencies were suspicious about Austria because we had some strange governments, and so that's a odd sort of punishment. But I don't think that the punishment really took place. Intelligence sharing goes beneath the governments most of the time. So it's a good question, but it does not really derogate the definition of neutrality. Like if you have hybrid warfare or cyber warfare, neutral states have to, like any other states, have to prevent it that it affects the Austrian infrastructure. So you have to do anything. It's a sort of armed neutrality. You have to defend neutrality with all kinds of means. So intelligence sharing could be one of those to keep foreign influence outside, but that is not only true for neutral states. So and neutral states do what they can. So if you have a massive invasion by a foreign power, neutral states can do what they can do. They might be overrun. And the Red Army during the Cold War, they might have overrun Austria. So they cannot blame us. So if there is a hybrid war against Austria, you defend yourself as much as you can. And you use also intelligence share. Actually, neutral states are allowed to ask for aid from other states, even military, if they are attacked. So it depends really on the definition of attack. I would hesitate to say a hybrid war is a direct attack. So I would only go up to the 67 war, which was a preemptive war. That would be my limit to say it's you defend yourself. But I wouldn't go beyond that. So that's
Ariel.
We talked a lot about the credibility of Austrian neutrality, and I want to ask about the usefulness. In an age in which Austria is surrounded by the EU, and it hasn't hosted a lot of espionage as it did in the Cold War period, or a lot of international conventions, except maybe the IEA.
Yeah.
Is Austrian,
the IEA is there because Austria was neutral.
yeah,
So that's 57. So that was shortly after Austria became neutral. The IEA decided to go there. All the other institutions like Geneva also. And but I do think you have to make a distinction between neutral policy and neutrality. So more or less, Austria got all these institutions because it was neutral. It was not that much because Austria was really active to do this. So that's, and to my mind, Austria is not doing enough active neutrality policy. It could do much more. So one example. So I don't want to go to the specifics now, Middle East. Actually, Bruno Kreisky was the first one, the first statesman who brought the question of the two-state solution before the United Nations. So you might like it or not, but it was an Austrian useful initiative. So until suggested by Marshall Plan for the third war. But I give you a more general example. Austria is the only country in the European Union which has the same status as most of the states of the global south, non-aligned and nuclear weapon free. So, and Austria was the main initiator that might be not well known here of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is different to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's it went into force 2021. Most of the signatories come from the global south, not from Europe, because NATO countries did not sign up to it. So, but Austria would be the only country which has the same start. So it could be a bridge between the European Union and those states in the global south. Our governments didn't want to discover it. They don't see it. They don't do it. It could be a possibility. Austria could even play the card and say we are the only country in the European Union with the UN seats, because Switzerland is not part of the European Union. So Austria would have so many assets to play, and this usefulness is mainly passive, what I would criticize. I don't see really, other states are much more active. So we had this debate yesterday, you have a little different opinion, but I do think small states like Qatar or Oman are much more active and doing that what neutral states should do, mediate between conflicting parties. So they have all their difficulties as well and all their problems. But Austria, the only thing, no, I stop here. So that's okay. I stop here.
if I may continue my question, what I was about to ask is, how can Austria try to become neutrally useful for the new emerging powers like India or China? because we're no longer in the Cold War. It was useful for the Soviets. The Soviets aren't around anymore.
Yeah.
With all due respect to the global South.
No, but I don't deny that other countries are much more useful than Austria. So already, which is a mistake of Austrian policy. That's not the fault of neutrality. That's the fault of our politicians. So Turkey is a much more respected mediator right now. So Austria misses all the opportunities there. So I was referring to the CSC, that was useful, the neutral non-aligned countries. By the way, Yugoslavia at that time in the 80s played exactly the role which I think Austria should play now, because Yugoslavia was part of the CSC process, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Helsinki document, and a leading state in the non-aligned movement. I'm supervising a doctoral thesis right now. She would look at the comparison, what Yugoslavia did at that time and what Austria could do now. So, and whether there was a real causal link between non-aligned movement and CSC, or where there are different processes. So this is the question of the doctoral thesis.
Dean.
You talked about how neutrality is a very good security guarantee, except for major wars, but that kind of sounds like it's a security guarantee until you need it. So I don't, and beyond that, you said that the United States was the guarantor for Austrian neutrality, which is pretty much de facto Article 5 protection. So I don't really see how the saying that neutrality is a good shield for external threats. If when conflict does arise, you have cases like the aforementioned Cambodia, the Netherlands during World War II, Belgium during World War I and World War II. So I don't really understand. It mostly just sounds like piggybacking off a existing security architecture and taking advantage of the fact that you're not living next to an expansionist, revanchist neighbor like Russia.
Yeah, to some extent, it's a good argument, but I would just turn it around. Anyway, I mentioned that Austria was living next to the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, so it's not so much difference to Finland is right now. I thought about the argument, which is well thought, but if it comes to major war, neutral states are never the target countries first. So it's all the hostile alliance. It's all the big states. I checked even during the Second World War, the casualty rate of Austria and Belgium, for example, is Belgium much lower. So Austria had about 400,000 casualties, and Belgium had a lot as well. It was about 60,000. It was higher in the Netherlands because Netherlands was directly involved in the Normandy invasion at that time, because it was directly involved in the war. So, but yeah, if you know, during the Second World War, Germany easily could have gone through Switzerland and not through Belgium. So Switzerland was lucky, and maybe for all these dirty tricks they did, so that might be possible. So you can't be lucky or not if it comes to major war, but you're never the one who really is the first target. So neutrality is not a panacea that you can prevent wars. Even so, I have to tell a story which I told yesterday about him. It is possible that a neutrality can really prevent a major war. Kaiser Franz Joseph from Austria was in Great Britain visiting King Edward VII, Great Britain, 1907. So we had already all this alliance building. The two, Zweibund, Dreibund, the three party alliance, two party alliance, all this mixing also in Asia. You know war is coming and you know that there will be a conflict. I doubt that Germany would have dared to go to war alone against Russia, against France, against Serbia. So I doubt it's counterfactual, I don't know. But of course, Austria wanted an alliance with Germany, and if an alliance is at war, you are the victim of entanglement. So it can be can provide peace neutrality as well. You cannot provide prevent major war. So in that point, you're correct. So that's once in a while you're a victim of major wars, but you're never a target, a primary target. And then, if you're credible, other major power would say don't violate, like Great Britain, First World War, Eisenhower in '56, right?
Maybe one more question from someone else. Dean, go ahead.
I just don't really see the crux of my argument was that Austria de facto had not quite an alliance, but the most important part of the alliance, which is Article 5 protection.
No, it never had.
No, but you
No.
said that Eisenhower said that if
Yeah,
Austrian
credibility.
neutrality was violated.
Credibility was Article 5 for Austria.
Yes.
Credibility was it, not the treaty.
No, I didn't mean in an official de jure way. I meant that de facto kind of way.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, no, but what I'm saying is that, lost my train of thought. That the important part of an alliance without the de jure signing of it, Austria did have, and that whether, just because Belgium or the Netherlands weren't the immediate targets of Germany, or Cambodia wasn't the immediate target for the United States or Vietnam or North Vietnam. I mean, fundamentally, Cambodia was still bombed to smithereens, and so was Belgium, and so was the Netherlands. Belgium was utterly devastated by the First World War, more so than France or Germany themselves. So I just don't really see with Switzerland has an extreme militarization, so it makes sense to go through Belgium rather than through Switzerland. But the whole, if neutrality is credible on its own, irrespective of that, I just don't really see how that argument stacks up, considering specifically Austria, Eisenhower said that pretty much de facto, not de jure, has Article 5 protection if the neutrality was violated.
No, it was not Article 5. That's what I reject. So you have other means. You have other means, and it's not. That's why I say you have to be credible, that to be respected. So credibility is a good protection. That's what I'm saying. You have to, but you have to say, those who rely on Article 5, they're more lazy than neutral states. Okay, we have Article 5, we are protected. That's fine. Neutral states always have to make clear that they want to stay out of war. They always have to show it. So credibility is much more difficult to achieve than just sitting there. I'm nasty to the Finns now, and because I don't like that decision. So anyway, I have to admit it. The Finns did not send much UN peacekeeping troops before that. So of course they had a big army, but they did not provide troops to Africa. Austria in '56 started to send troops to Congo in order to demonstrate that we are useful. We're useful for peacekeeping. Yeah? The Finns didn't. So they were more lazy. What is the name? Argument for trade fire. So, but they were just looking for themselves. They're picking the reasons for themselves. Austrian soldiers were in the harm's way at the time, so they're doing this. So now Finland is in NATO. So maybe now the NATO asks them to provide troops there and there and there, but that Austria's contribution to its neutrality was much stronger than the Finnish contribution. So now they are protected by NATO. Austria is not protected by NATO, and Austria has to provide other means in order to show that they can stay out of great power conflict, which is not entirely possible. That I admit.
We'll have to finish here. Our time is up. Please join me in thanking Professor Gartner for extending the lecture. Thank you.
Okay.